But we have this morning two internationally renowned thought leaders that will give us absolutely fascinating perspectives. We have Mampela Rampele, very well-known activist, co-founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, also a medical doctor, renowned academic and business person, former vice chancellor of the University of Cape Town, one time managing director of the World Bank, and currently co-president of the Club of Rome. But we will hear firstly from Clem Sunter, of course, South Africa's most highly regarded scenario planner and strategist. Affectionately known, Clem, I think you'll accept this, as the foxy futurist. He's an icon, of course, model of mental aliveness, responsible for scenario planning unit at Anglo American, where he was also CEO and chairman during the 1990s. Found a calling, he says, in mounting unique and creative solutions to fit circumstances no longer defined by the box. Also recently received an honorary doctorate from the University of Cape Town for his work in the field of scenario planning, and really is, I think, what we might call a CEO's CEO, voted as the speaker who's made the most significant contribution to and impact on best practice and business in South Africa by leading South African CEOs. He's also lectured at Harvard Business School, but nobody's perfect. What Clem doesn't know is that I've been stalking him for many years and have been studying his books, and I have a number of them here in front of me, well known throughout the world. So ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you if we could unmute ourselves for just a moment, and in an attempt to resemble the reality of being with each other in person, as I think many of us wish we were, if I could ask you to unmute yourselves, and if I could ask you to welcome our two esteemed guests with a warm round of applause.
Hello, Clem.
Welcome.
Clem, we'll hand straight over to you.
Thank you so much, Mornay, and it is a real honor to be on the same platform as Mampela, who I've known for a long time, and your good self. And this is a moment which is incredibly important because we're talking about the most important topic around. I know that there are so many other issues in the news, but this has to be the biggest one of all, which is the future of our planet. I'm basing the presentation on this book, which came out on July the 1st from Penguin Random House. It's called Thinking the Future, New Perspectives from the Shoulders of Giants. And what I'm going to do is go through the giants that we talk about in this book and show how their thinking can be applied to the meeting which is about to take place in Glasgow, and which is going to discuss the kind of measures that should be taken to reduce carbon emissions in order to preserve the sustainability of our planet. I'm very pleased to say that the book is now in its third reprint since it was published. It has been in the bestseller charts of exclusive books and also on Amazon in Kindle form. And so, yeah, the message is beginning to get around. I think the first chapter is one of the most important because it sets the methodology which should be used to have a discussion about the future of the planet. And I only hope that COP26 actually adopts this methodology. We contrast two ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. Plato believed in the ideal form. He felt that all of us ordinary mortals lived in a cave, looking at the shadows of the real things outside. And it was only really intelligent philosophers like himself who would go out into the sun and through a process of incredibly concentrated thought, reach the ideal world and the forms that existed in it. And he can be contrasted with Aristotle, who basically believed that life was what it is. It's what you observe, it's what you experience, and that you had to, in a continuous way, recognize all the things going on around you and build up theories based on what you observed and link cause to effect. So he really was the originator of the scientific approach. And he also believed that you could change your mind as new evidence came in. So one contrasted this kind of thinking towards a perfect vision, which Plato had, versus Aristotle, who had this more messy scientific approach of observing the facts. And many years later, in fact, in the last century, in the 50s and 60s, there was a professor at Oxford called Isaiah Berlin, who we feature as our third giant, who wrote a book called The Hedgehog and the Fox. And he related it to a saying of another ancient Greek poet called Archilochus, who said, "The hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things." And obviously Plato, according to Berlin, was the ultimate hedgehog, and Aristotle was a fox. And we decided, Chantal Ilbery and myself, to write a book in 2001 where we took this metaphor and applied it to futures thinking, where on the one hand, if you make a forecast and you bet everything on that forecast, you're a bit of a hedgehog. Whereas if you're a fox, you're a natural scenario planner, where you deal in multiple futures. You weigh up the odds on those futures by looking at the flags that are going up around you, and you keep them all in mind at the same time. And you can change your mind. You can come up with a new scenario if evidence shows that you should. So you're much more flexible and agile than a forecaster. And it just so happens at the moment that the two most popular books in America and around the world are based on forecasting, not on scenario planning. The first is called Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock, and he uses the same metaphor that we did in The Mind of a Fox to show that you should add probabilities to forecasts and then say, this is what's going to happen, but this is the kind of probability you should give it at the moment based on all the statistical evidence around. So he went part of the way to becoming a fox. And in fact, he basically says that foxes can forecast the future better than hedgehogs. And of course, Nate Silver, with his book, The Signal and the Noise, showed how important it is that you should have flags with which to assess the validity of your forecasts. But Mitchell Ilbery, Chantal's son, with whom I wrote this book, and I feel that if you're a genuine fox, you should go beyond forecasting and you should look at scenarios, different possible futures for the world. And there's one very important reason that I will refer to later on for doing this, which is you engage people's emotion as well as their intellect. Just saying to somebody that there is a 55 to 60% probability that the Earth's temperature will go up more than 1.5 degrees by 2060. It's not going to engage their emotion. It's not going to motivate them to do something about it. Whereas if you offer them different possibilities, good and bad, you actually get into their mind and they think, what can I do to make the positive future happen? We had that back in the 1980s when the team that I was working with in Anglo-American produced scenarios for South Africa, the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a possible wasteland. And by offering South Africans the choice between the two scenarios, you gave them a feeling that they, indeed could in ways influence the future, much better than putting a forecast to them that there was a 55% chance of South Africa reaching negotiation in the 1990s. Offer people possibilities, and that motivates them to take action. So I would really love some convincing scenarios to be put in front of the COP26 audience in Glasgow, so that they are aware of those possibilities and can start doing things for themselves. But the other point about scenario work is, because you're looking at possible futures, you can be much more extreme and adventurous with those scenarios than you can with a forecast. And I've always said that scenarios should be like movie scripts. In fact, the original word scenario planning came from an American called Herman Kahn in 1960, when he wrote a book on a thermonuclear war between the Soviet Union and America. And he coined the phrase scenario planning because he lived close to Hollywood, and he remembered that his friends who were movie directors wrote scenarios or summary of movie scripts, which they then peddled around to raise money. And he thought, that's exactly what I'm going to be doing, a movie script on a possible all-out war between Russia and America. And his book was a huge success that he wrote on thermonuclear war. But the point is this, that you can capture very unusual futures. Indeed, Chantal and I captured in the book, The Mind of a Fox, published in June 2001, in a letter we wrote to George Bush in the book, we said that one of his biggest possibilities was a massive terrorist strike on a Western city. And it happened 3 months after we published the book. And I remember being rung up by the US State Department 6 months later, saying, how could two South Africans write a possibility about a strike when no American intelligence agency had raised it? And to be honest, I said, that's because you guys don't do scenario planning. You don't use a kind of technique that can capture an abnormal future and then look for the flags that might tell you that it is increasing in probability. That's the core of our approach. So we feel very strongly that this huge topic that we're addressing today needs a scenario approach, which brings me on to the second giant that we feature in this book, which is Socrates, because Socrates, another ancient Greek philosopher, was well known for asking questions called the Socratic method, where you have no sacred cows. You question everything. And indeed, Socrates died because the jury in Athens felt that he was asking far too searching questions about Athenian society, and he died. He was put to death because he believes so strongly that you've got to go into the life and all your basic assumptions about life in a very, very penetrating way to arrive at the truth. And right now there are two major questions around the whole environmental debate, and which, if Socrates were alive today, he would definitely ask about. The first one relates to population. I mean, we are now living in a century with 8 billion people. Just to put that in perspective, the population in 1920 was around 2 billion. And obviously, everybody has a fundamental right to have as many children as they wish. But we have to consider what impact on this planet that we as a human species are having. And as one of the subsequent giants we mentioned in the book, Charles Darwin says, he talks about reproduction of the species being one of the critical tests of a successful species. But if you are, as a species, leading to the extinction of other species, you have to be very, very careful. I mean, it's not just us as the human species, it's all the farm animals that we have in the world. I was mentioning just earlier that there are 28 billion chickens in the world. There are 1 billion sheep, 1 billion cattle, and yet there are only 28,000 rhinos in the world, down from 200,000 at the beginning of the 20th century. So we're seeing, apart from global warming, an extinction of a species because we have taken over more of the earth, we're cutting down forests, we're moving the vast number of species into more and more limited habitats and environments. And Socrates would have said, what are you going to do about this? I haven't heard anybody who's going to COP26 discussing this kind of issue, but it's absolutely essential that we have a conversation around it. And the other major thing Socrates would ask is, do you think that economic development and material prosperity should be the central driving principle behind mankind, which has been the essence of civilization in the world to this point in time? And, you know, shouldn't you be thinking about other things? Because, you know, everybody has their particular carbon footprint. And, you know, if you are going to raise that carbon footprint by making them richer, you're going to create a real problem in the world. I mean, there's one statistic that we quote in this book, that the richest 1% of the world's population have in total twice the carbon emissions that the poorest 50% of the world have. That's a well-researched statistic. So, yeah, I mean, you have to ask yourself, what is it that we're going to do to reduce our carbon footprint, and particularly the super rich? I mean, the other statistic that I was told a few years ago was that if China ever reaches the per capita income that America has today, we'll need 4 planets for resource consumption, because the Chinese have a much larger population, 1.4 billion compared to America's 330 million. And yeah, it's a question that has to be asked in a Socratic way, and answers are given. So I hope that these kind of questions are raised at COP26. The third philosophers that we raise in the book as giants are the Stoics. Everybody thinks that a Stoic philosopher is somebody who bears up in adversity, but it's much wider than that. And I'd like to read you what Epictetus said a long time ago, one of the top Stoic philosophers. The chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own. And this is terribly important when looking at the future, is to understand what you control and what you don't control, so that by applying your mind to what you control, you can influence that whole world outside, because there is an overlap between the two, and you can, in that sliver of overlap, make a huge difference, as someone like Greta Thunberg has done because of modern social media, and you know, coming forward and challenging people about environmental sustainability. And it's very, very important, again, that this summit in Glasgow concentrates on what they can control and sets clear objectives with measurable outcomes so that it changes the external world. Which brings me to an incredibly important part of the book, which is our chapter 4, which is all about the man who taught me scenario planning. His name was Pierre Wack. He was a Frenchman, and he introduced scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell, and then came and worked as a consultant at Anglo-American from the early 80s to the early 90s, and helped us write the high road and low road scenarios. And Pierre said, there are essentially 3 things that you should do in terms of looking at the future. And again, we feel all these 3 steps have to be undertaken by COP26. The first one is to identify the rules of the game that will apply in future. Not the rules of the game of the past, because we all know the game changes, but the rules of the game in future. And the reason he said this is you've got to ground your scenarios in reality. And the rules are a reality check. You shouldn't have 360-degree scenarios like the Delphic Oracle. You've got to narrow the cone of uncertainty into the future by looking at the trends and looking at the rules, and so that you have a plausible set of scenarios. And indeed, I think there are certain rules that apply. The first one is climate change is for real. I remember in 2006, I had to do a facilitation for the top climate change scientists in the world who were advising the American and British government at the time. They just met at Chatham House and they asked to have a private meeting, and I was asked to facilitate that meeting. And I remember saying to them around the table, what probability do you attach to your thesis that it's man-made emissions that create climate change is correct? And they said 95%. Obviously, there is a chance that we're all wrong around this table, but would you get on a plane with a 95% chance of crashing? No. And that is exactly why we are so forceful with this incredibly important piece of science, because we've got to do something about it. So yes, I know there are climate deniers in the world who say it's just a cycle and it's gonna cool down again, and it's nothing to do with man-made carbon emissions. But they've got to, like Aristotle, search for the science, and certainly the scientists more and more now are coming up with genuine science. But they're all saying one thing to me now, which is that they were wrong about one thing, which is they thought all this was going to happen in the late part of this century, but in fact it's happening right now. The frequency of extreme weather events, extreme rainfall, wiping out villages in Germany, extreme heat, causing widespread fires in California, rising sea levels, causing problems in small island groups like Grenada. It's all there and it's happening. And so you can't wish away these kind of events. People are saying that one in a 1,000-year events now can become 1 in 10-year events because of the way our atmosphere is changing because of climate science. So that is a rule of the game. The second rule is that it requires a level of cooperation we have never seen in the world to overcome this problem. As you will hear later on, one of our giants is an eminent historian in the UK. And she says that conflict is at the basis of all history. And yeah, whether it's conflict within countries or conflict between countries. And right now, we have a rising rivalry between the two biggest economies in the world, America and China. But this particular issue, a rule of the game is that it requires a level of cooperation which has never been seen before, because if some nations fail, it's going to affect everybody. I mean, you think about, you know, most problems that countries have, it affects them, it affects their population, like the terrible things that are going on in Lebanon at the moment. But in this particular case, if you have a problem with carbon emissions, you are affecting every single other nation on Earth. So it's a rule of the game. And then the third point really comes from those Socratic questions, which is the fundamental principles of civilization are going to have to be reviewed and changed. And we've got to have a discussion about that, because, you know, we do want to advance as the human species, but we've got to have a conversation about what the future should be in terms of developing our civilization within the first two rules of the game, that we have to do something about our carbon emissions, and that we have to cooperate as a team. The second step that Pierre said was that, having identified the rules of the game, you've got to look at the key uncertainties, the key driving forces that can determine our future. And right now, in terms of the climate change topic, there are two driving forces. The first is whether we're going to move forward in a more united world than we have today, or whether indeed the world is going to become more divided. There are so many flags going up on division. There's division within nations in America caused by social media and the polarization between Republicans and Democrats. We have obviously the increasing rivalry between China on the one side, which is an autocracy, and America on the other side as a democracy. And indeed, America has put together a coalition of democracies by including India, Australia, and Japan in what's called the Quad to offset the influence of China in the South China Sea. So, you know, this question of whether we're moving into a more united or divided world is a key uncertainty. And the other uncertainty is whether we have a genuine sense of green commitment, or whether in fact it's just apathy coated in rhetoric. And a lot of people are cynical about the politicians and are cynical about this particular summit, saying, as Greta Thunberg says, it's just going to be blah, blah, blah. And yeah, it is obviously something we're going to have to watch. Now, if you consider those uncertainties as the axis of a matrix, the y-axis is around, the vertical axis is around whether we have a united or divided world, and the horizontal axis is whether we're going to have green commitment in future or green apathy. It creates four scenarios, because that's what Pierre said. You've identified the rules of the game to narrow the range of the scenarios, and you have identified the driving forces. And we have four scenarios that should be considered at COP26. The first one, the positive one, is in a united world, we have genuine green commitment, and we call it Paradise Regained, after the John Milton poem. that we recover that rich diversity of the planet that we had before the sixth extinction of species and before we had climate change. The second scenario is where we just have the rhetoric, the blah, 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 and it's green apathy. And yes, the world is fairly united in kind of making speeches and doing all that, but they don't have a proper conversation about it. They just make speeches, and we call that paradise lost. And yeah, it means that our children and our grandchildren are going to have a much tougher time than the current generation, which is spectacular, because if you think about it, since the beginning of mankind, we've all kind of improved materially and in terms of medicine and all the other things. And to think that our grandchildren are going to have an inferior life to us is unbelievable. But that's what happens in Paradise Lost. But then if you have a divided world, but with some green commitment, we call that scenario isolated Edens, where Scandinavian countries and other try to create their own Garden of Edens in their country, but in the end it fails because, yeah, the whole world, the whole planet is going to be affected by climate change. I mean, I watched that short flight the other day by Blue Origin, which Jeff Bezos put together. And one point that William Shatner made at the end of the flight, the actor in Star Trek, he said the thing that really got to him was how thin the atmosphere is, and blasting off in a rocket at 2,000 miles an hour, you just go through that incredibly thin layer between, as he called it, blue and life and black and death when you're above the atmosphere. And yeah, it's that fragility that makes the scenario of isolated Edens, fairly hard to contemplate, because in the end, we'll all drop down to a sort of depressing mean. The last scenario is where all hell lets loose before the end of this century. It's where you have a divided world, you have green apathy, and we call it pandemonium, because that's what you'll have. You'll have millions upon millions of climate refugees trying to get into countries that are inhabitable from countries that are uninhabitable. We're already seeing it around the world. And yes, some of those countries are uninhabitable because they've got dreadful governments, but we're talking about uninhabitable because of extreme weather patterns. And yeah, you're going to see wars over water probably developing at the same time. You're going to see coastal cities disappearing along with island nations in the middle of the ocean. You're going to see the Arctic and Antarctic no longer possessing ice, along with Greenland. All that magnificent diversity is going to disappear. But of course, the challenge of the pandemonium scenario is not just going to be environmental, it's going to be economic. And we could have the most staggering crash, which completely overshadows the Great Depression of the last century, if this happens. And that's what we should use, as I said, to motivate the people at this particular Congress into taking action. The next point in the methodology is to identify the flags which will tell you whether a scenario is becoming more probable or not. It's a chapter on Karl Popper, who was a scientific philosopher who talked of clockworks, clocks and clouds. Clocks were things that were fairly predictable in the sense that they tick away And clouds are like the clouds in the sky. They change shape all the time, and you don't know where you'll be years hence. And he said, the actual fact is the world has a continuum from very improbable to very probable. And we think that you've got to apply flags to the scenarios to see whether they're increasing in probability or not. And of course, one of the most important flags is going to be the actual rises in temperature of the world and how accurate they are. We're going to have to watch that relationship between China and America, because that is a very, very important flag. But a very green flag could be technology, because it may well be that we will come up with incredible technologies which make fossil fuels obsolete, and we mustn't rule that out. I mean, one of the greatest things about the pandemic over the last 2 years has been the fact that vaccines were produced so quickly to change the game. It wasn't the politicians. They hummed and hawed, they went into lockdown and out of lockdown. But it was that small number of scientists around the world, including that German couple of Turkish origin who invented the Pfizer vaccine. You know, these were the incredible people, and show how important technology is in terms of changing the probability of the scenarios. And it's just possible we can come up with incredible technologies so that we can replace most of the things that we do with technologies that don't have carbon emissions. So the next point was raised by David Hume. He's one of the giants in this book. He's a Scottish philosopher that lived in the 18th century, the period of enlightenment it's called, and he made one statement: reason is the slave of passion, and that we're very complex creatures. And that's why it is so important to engage people's emotion on this issue, because, as he said, reason is the slave of passion. So, yeah, we must, use the scenario process and write real movie scripts so that we really engage people. Our next giant is Charles Darwin, who obviously preached about adaptation, but as we say in the chapter, it's not just about adaptation, it's about innovation at the same time. And that's exactly what happened with these vaccines. It's exactly what is going to have to happen in terms of seeking a new way of life and a new type of civilization. We're going to need those innovations, which, and this is the wonderful thing about life, it's totally random. The people who actually come up with the most incredible thoughts are all over the world. And we don't know who they are at the moment, but suddenly they come forward and they come up with something new. Which brings me to probably the most important chapter we have in the book, which is on a moral dimension to the future and developing an ethical compass. And we talk about 4 giants in this chapter. The first is a Jewish philosopher and called Hannah Arendt. She wrote a book on the Eichmann trial in the last century, and she said one thing which is very important. She said that any action has irreversible consequences to it. And yes, we can overcome and mitigate those consequences to a point by making promises and seeking forgiveness. But that you must never forget that action, has this tendency to produce something that is irreversible. And we know that what we're doing at the moment is is having an irreversible effect on the planet, and we ought to do something about it. The second lady we feature in this book is Philippa Foot, a British philosopher who wrote about the dilemma we always face in morality. She talked of somebody standing on a bridge over a railway track which had a side track just beyond the bridge, and you could control the points which could lead to the side track. And on the main track, you had 5 human beings tied to the track, and on the side track, 1 small girl. And a train is coming through the bridge, and you have the ability to throw the switch. And it means the train might go over that small girl. It can go over the 5 adults sitting on the track. And the question is, do you do anything? Because, you know, it means you have moral culpability if you do. But on the other hand, a lot of moral problems are steering between Scylla and Charybdis. In other words, there are downsides on both sides. And we all know that when decisions are taken about the future of the planet, there are going to be downsides to those decisions. It's not perfect. And therefore, you know, we must actually do our best to make the most optimal decisions, which will have good and bad elements in it. We feature Martin Luther King in this chapter because, again, what he showed was that you can engage people's emotion even by being grounded in reality. When he made that famous speech in 1963, he said, "I have a dream, but it's based on the reality that there is an existing creed in America that all men are equal." And he said, you know, my dream is that my 4 children will be treated equally. And so, yes, we feel very strongly that, you know, you've got to really evoke the emotional and ethical side of people by ensuring that you are doing something which is considered morally and constitutionally acceptable. And the last giant we feature in the book was called C.V. Wedgwood. She was an eminent historian in the last century, and she said, human life is dramatic. It is born and exists in conflict. And she wrote a book on the English Civil War in the 17th century. And you know, it shows what an incredible challenge creating that level of unity in the world is going to require if, as one of our basic parts of our DNA, is this sense of conflict. The second last chapter of the book we call Thinking and Doing, because people aren't considered great if they're just thinkers. It's a question of thinking something out and then doing it. Churchill would never have been remembered and quoted if he'd lost the Second World War. And so we feature 2 giants in that in the chapter. Nelson Mandela, who I had the privilege of visiting in prison a month before his release in January 1990. He wanted to discuss the high road and low road scenarios. And his entire conversation was about the future. It was nothing about the past, and it was about seeking reconciliation. And as soon as he came out of prison, he did things which ensured that was going to happen. Whenever the talks that we had in South Africa started falling apart, he would get together with de Klerk to make sure that they get on track again. It was his actions that transformed South Africa, as much as the thought inside his mind. And the other person that we feature is Steve Jobs, who was incredible. He was of Syrian extraction. He was brought up by American parents, the Jobs family, and he became this incredible person who's changed all our lives with those beautiful devices that he's made, the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod. You know, this guy was incredible. As he said, you've got to be a thinker-doer. You've got to put a ding in the universe. And that's exactly what's got to happen with COP26. They want to put a ding in the universe. They're not going to be considered on the kind of speeches that are made. It's because as a result of that meeting, you're going to see things actually done. And the last chapter in this book is planting seeds. It's dealing with the education of the future, the education of our children. And that's where a whole debate on what civilization will really mean in the future is so apt. Because at the moment, education is teaching kids about the values of the last century. We haven't changed the curriculum. We haven't actually changed the way we deliver education, given all these incredible scientific advances we've made in communicating with people. So we're going to have to consider how we can plant the seeds which allow a new kind of civilization to prosper, which means going back and seeing what we're going to teach at schools, what we're going to teach at universities. This is all incredibly important for the planet's future. So I hope I've shown you that the scenario method is much better than forecasting in terms of creating the kind of platform for people collectively to change their way of life by changing their own individual carbon footprints, but also the leaders of our nations to actually get together and change the sort of macro economy in a way that allows carbon emissions to drop. We have the wider problem, which I've talked about, of making sure that we create a planet where other species can live alongside us, and we certainly stop the kind of extinction of species that is going on at the moment. So I hope that I've entertained you today, but most of all, I hope that this coming meeting uses the kind of technique and even the scenarios that we've outlined in order to set the basis for doing things differently. And I'll end with a benediction for all of you who've listened to me and also for the COP delegates. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Wow, Clem, thank you so much. Absolutely inspiring. I'm sure we can all listen to you for another few hours, but it's been inspiring just to hear your elegant narrative of those giants: Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Epictetus, Popper, Hume, Darwin, Arendt, Foote, Wedgwood, Mandela, Jobs, and others. And then to weave through this very disciplined methodological approach that you have, Clem, which of course we appreciate here at the Institute for Futures Research, of multiple possible futures. And then I love that idea of making a ding on the universe. And you've certainly made a ding on my universe, I should say, for many years. Well, someone else who's made a number of dings on my universe over the last few years, and who I've respected also for many years, an icon of the South African landscape, in addition to her many accolades that I mentioned earlier, is also a prolific author and thought leader, among others, of Conversations with My Sons and Daughters, A Passion for Freedom, Across Boundaries, Steering by the Stars, A Bed Called Home, and a large number of other thought leadership pieces. She is currently the co-president of the Club of Rome, and certainly one of the inspirations behind my own authorship. We'll give you an opportunity now, Mampela, if you'll unmute yourself, to give us your response to Clem.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Moni, for organizing this. And thanks very much, Clem, as always, thought-provoking and entertaining. And that's really important because that's part of how you touch people's emotions. I very much enjoyed listening to your tour of the great thinkers and what we can learn from them. But I want to remind all of you that those great thinkers, particularly the Greeks, learned their philosophy at the feet of African priests in ancient Egypt. And if you think that I'm just being provocative, I'm going to ask you to do yourself a favor and look up a book called Stolen Legacy, which was published in 1954. And this is not to take away from the great thinkers, the contributions they've made to build on what they learned in Egypt to create what is now called Greek philosophy. And from there you have German and other philosophers. And so it's important for us as we celebrate the work of these great giants to also go back to where we all come from, which is Africa, and see the link between those. And this link will become obvious as I continue my comments. So Clem, I think you make an unanswerable case for people's emotion leading to action, because as a co-president of the Club of Rome, I can tell you that our founder, Aurelio Piche, died somewhat sad, as a sad man, because after going through the issue of modeling, whether you call it forecasting, we were able 50 years ago to anticipate that what's happening today with climate change would happen unless humanity changed course and stopped this addiction to economic growth. And so the book, The Limits to Growth, sold 30 million copies. So it really was interesting to people. It's very dense. It was done through modeling at MIT, so you couldn't doubt its science and its fact-based. But it did not move humanity to action away from this fascination with limitless growth. We are where we are now. But our founder didn't leave it at the point of being disillusioned. He did what you talked about, Clem, of finding ways of getting people's emotions engaged. To say there will be climate change didn't move people. But then he sponsored the publication of a book called No Limits to Learning. And this connects with your last point, which I'll come back to, that there is what he identified as the human gap, which is the gap between what we know we need to do and our capacity to actually do what we need to do. And this capacity is not a technical capacity, it's bringing the willingness to do things the way we know we should do them in terms of what the evidence is telling us. And so after that, very few people, in fact, I'm sure in this webinar, have ever read No Limits to Learning. And yet everything tells us today that there is something wrong with the kind of learning approaches that we have, because education as we have it is based still on principles derived in the 17th, 18th, if we are lucky, 19th century. And so we have to find other ways of getting people engaged, which still, Clem, follows your logic of how do you get to people's emotions. Now, you know me from South Africa, that I come from a country where we had this most incredible irony that you'll have people coming from Europe and settling in Africa and then calling us, people who look like me, non-Europeans. Now, where was the logic of that? How can I go to the US and say to people they are non-Africans, or go to China and say to the Chinese they are non-Africans? They'll probably run me out of town. But we didn't run the Europeans out of town. We actually embraced their negative stereotyping of who we were, the non-persons. So change in South Africa didn't come about because the ANC was able to shoot its way through the borders and liberate South Africa. No. What led to the struggle, forcing the conversation, the negotiations that Clem was talking about, was a process which started very interestingly, where the Club of Rome was founded in 1968. And 1968 was a year when the whole world had some form of uprising against the Vietnam War, young students, etc. So we caught the wind as young South Africans, and I was then a medical student. And that's how the Black consciousness movement was formed. Now that was absolutely critical. It was a seed of revitalizing the liberation struggle. And what we came to is an understanding that for as long as you are mentally enslaved by a system, it doesn't matter whether it's drugs or whatever, you are in fact a prisoner, that even if you are to be let out of prison, you will not be a free person. And so we realize that liberation starts not in the mind, but in the mind and heart. So psychological and emotional freedom is what closes that gap that Aurelio had identified, but also what helped us as young activists to overcome the fear of the apartheid system and be able to take them on. And it is in the process of liberating ourselves from being non-Europeans, non-white, to say, no, no, we are Black, we are proud, and we have a future. And guess what? That future will be a better future if both Black and white people sat down and actually recognize one central point, which I'll come back to again, but I want to make it now, that the real freedom of a people, and I would say of the human species, is doing what an indigenous leader in Australia said to a writer that I'll talk about later on, that we need to become indigenous again. What did he mean by that? He meant that to be really fully human, you've got to go back to the essence of being the essence of being human is to be recognize that we are interconnected, interdependent, and we are part of nature, not outside of it. So this whole idea of greening tells you, it's a, you know, I grew up in a time when you still wore slips, and it shows, it's a slip that shows under your skirt. There is no greening needed. What is needed is a return to an understanding that to be human is to be connected to others and to be part of nature and not outside of it. And then you realize that everything is connected to everything else. Now, when you have that, I don't buy the idea of our DNA is conflict. No, that's a Western way of looking at this. Incidentally, we have this joke with some friends at the Club of Rome about the Enlightenment in Europe there was neither light nor civility, because the same people who were preaching enlightenment in Europe were actually backing the destruction of human dignity in the rest of the world, or most of the world as it turns out. So I just want to make that as an opening statement. But I want to come back concretely to some of the points that you raised, Clem, the population question. You clearly have touched on something which we have to look at. But people are not the problem. Because if you look at this footprint issue, the largest population is in China, in India, and of course, Africa is the largest in terms of population profile, has got the youthful population, which means that, you know, future population growth is likely to happen in Africa. So is that the problem? I would say no. The problem is, what kind of footprint do we have? If you look at the current figures of footprint, you'll see that the US, with its small population of 300 and something million, has a footprint per capita of 15.5, okay? India, which you will see, population problem, India, their footprint per capita is 1.9. And then that of China is 7.38. So I think we need to disabuse ourselves of the problem of the future and climate being population. No, it's the quality of and the nature of the footprint. Because if we talk innovation, machines can't innovate. You need people to innovate. So the issue of population, if we go back, which I will do at the end, to the planting the seeds of the future, if we have the kind of liberating education, then women are going to have the choice and able to have the choice to decide how many children they want to. I haven't yet met a woman who wants to have 10 children out of her free will. But if you are poor and you are in a migrant camp, you just see how many children are born out of non-choice. The second point I want to deal with is your issue of the, which flows from this, of which comes out of your reference to the Stoics. I'm being educated by my own son about this philosophy. I don't know anything. I'm not a philosopher. I haven't studied philosophy, but it helps to have children who have a little bit of literacy and they can teach you. So he's kind of made me a little bit literate when it comes to this. But at the Club of Rome, following on the footsteps of our founder, and when I say we, I mean the current leadership of the Club of Rome. I'm a co-president with Sandrine Dixon de Klerk, and we have got an executive committee, which for the first time is very diverse, with people from India, from China, from Malaysia, from Africa, in the person of yours truly. We are able to bring that diversity into the kind of conversations that the Stoics were talking about in terms of choices. And to be able to make choices, one has to be conscious that you have the capacity to make those choices. And so at the Club of Rome, instead of being focused on the crises that are upon us in terms of climate change, we decided to frame things in terms of this big question. How can humanity emerge out of these planetary emergencies with a new way of being human? So it's emergence from emergence. And to do that, we thought, well, let us look at what are the elements that we need to focus on this to get this journey of emergence from emergencies. The first theme, we have got 5 themes. The first theme is, yes, the planetary emergency is upon us, so we have to reduce our footprint. We've got to deal with fossil fuel, all of the things that are in the planetary emergency action plan. And we've got a whole 200 to at least partners in this. The second issue is, how do we reframe economics away from this love affair with economic growth as if is the end and be all? Because this limitless growth pursuit is what's getting us to where, got us where we are and will continue to keep us where we are. The third node is rethinking finance, because the economic systems that we have now are financialized. The finance system is the tail that's wagging the dog. And we know we have had crisis in 2001, we had crisis in 2008, we'll continue to have crisis until we stop the love affair of the financial system with this insatiable hunger for assets, which are fictitious assets in most cases. And of course, they are also driving the footprint issue and the continued investment in fossil fuels. The fourth theme we have at the Club of Rome is exactly what you were talking about. How can we have a new human civilization that is built on this understanding that to be human is to be interconnected, interdependent, and to consciously know you're part of nature? COVID has helped us make that obvious, that we are interconnected. What starts in China or in the US or in Latin America ends up where you stand. So we have hopefully been woken up from our sense of what you called in those scenarios, the isolated Edens. There is no Eden that can be isolated from the rest of the world. So I just want to make 3 last points. One is that this level of cooperation that you are appealing for the world to have cannot occur unless people are prepared to travel inside themselves. And so I don't go to COP conferences anymore because it's blah, blah, blah. And incidentally, the good news is that Greta is not alone as a youth force. One of the most important contributions the Club of Rome is making is to capture voices of young people from most of the world. And we have, as part of our program, even now we're going to have our annual meetings, a youth platform where young people themselves, we are not telling them what they should do. We're not teaching them. They are coming to say, we are not leaders of tomorrow or of the future. We are the leaders of now, and the now is in trouble. So we believe very strongly that a new human civilization is what we need to have. Finally, planting the seeds of the new civilization is going to require a fundamental change in the way we learn, we teach, we do research. These disciplinary boundaries that we have established, human beings are not in boxes. The innovations, Clem, that you're talking about don't usually come out of one discipline. They come from the interfaces between disciplines. And even these vaccines that have come to save lives, they come out of people who are doing things from different points of view. And so we need, as part of this human revolution, a complete transformation of teaching and learning on a global scale. And that, I believe, would be the way in which those people who do the blah blahs at COP26 will be challenged by young people who are liberated mentally, emotionally, and are able to claim the future that belongs to them. Thank you.
Mampela, gosh, absolutely fantastic response to Clem. And in a moment, Clem, I'm going to give you an opportunity for a rebuttal, and then we'll open up some conversations with the audience. But Mampela, just to say thank you so much for that very interesting reframing of some of the issues. Being as you are, as we all know you, a passionate champion for ancient African wisdom and for the love of all things human. The focus on the power of indigeneity from an epistemological perspective, from a way of knowing, I think was truly inspiring in what we heard from you. And the power of interconnectedness, I think, is yet another. So Clem, I'm going to give you an opportunity for a response, and then we're going to open up our conversation to see if there's curiosity further from the audience.
I don't want to rebut anything that Mampela said. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And I learned something which I'm going to use, which is this whole point about, you know, going back to nature and seeking that kind of original relationship we had with nature and obviously with one another, you know, covered by the word indigenous. And it's just opened up a whole new kind of perspective for me. So thanks so much, Mampela, for providing me with that, you know, that kind of insight. And yeah, and I'm so glad you agree that it's about appealing to people's emotion as much as to their intellect, because that is the huge difference between the kind of methodology I'm promoting of writing different scenarios and possibilities of the future, and then getting people to try and make the probability of the good one, you know, rise and to try and get rid of the bad scenario. You've got to think of that kind of interaction between emotion and action, because in the end, only action counts. Thank you very much.
Clem, thank you so much. I wonder if I could direct our conversation just a little bit, not to abuse my power here as the facilitator. We are here at a business school. We have alumni from the business school. Just behind me here, I have senior students from the very well-known Schema Business School in France. As we all know, business school students don't have emotions. So the question is, I'm joking patently, how do we engage these young people who themselves are interested in their next journey, their relationship with Africa, their interest in success for themselves, and for many of them, for their societies? Is there a way in which we can connect ideas of business with what could sometimes be seen as theoretical concepts of interconnectedness? Is there a way, and I'm going to make that open to both Mampela and Clem to help us here. We have real business students spending much of their lives in spreadsheets, thinking about the future of business and the future of their own careers. Is there a way in which businesses could adopt in a practical way some of these realities that you've challenged us with? Let me leave it open like that for now.
To Mampela.
You know what is really exciting, Clem? This emerging new civilization I was referring to is actually emerging. I'm on a trip now in Europe for the last week, and I'll be here for another 2 weeks. And we have met young people from business schools, Mone, some of them are already young professionals, young entrepreneurs who are saying they are tired of having to make a choice between their careers and their passions. Again, back to Clem's point about the importance of acting when your emotions are engaged. So what these young people are saying is that the education system that they have gone through has not prepared them for the 21st century. And so the issue is not whether you do business or not. The issue is how do you approach the teaching, the learning of business science. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to speak to students at IE University here in Madrid. Exactly the same thing. These are young people, two of whom came from South Africa, young women, of course. It's amazing that young people are not waiting for we, the golden oldies, to teach them how to do. They're asking the questions of how do we change the curriculum? How do we change the way we teach? This idea of, here are spreadsheets and so on. Yeah, you need to know how to do a spreadsheet at some stage. But the start of every learning process, and this I've learned from my friend John Gilmore, who is teaching young people from the slums of South Africa, Diepsloot, Langa, Nyanga, Guguletu, all of the places you wouldn't expect excellence from. And how does he do it? Using that same consciousness raising process that I talked about, which started with my generation. But it's not just about Black consciousness, it's about consciousness, human consciousness. What he does is to build or to create conversations. So his classrooms are not like the classrooms I see behind you, Mone. His classrooms are round tables. Because again, learning from Africa, when we have real serious conversation, we don't sit one behind the other. We want to see your eyes because that's where the emotions can express themselves. Joy, worry, anxiety, revelation. So when the young people sit around the table, they're able to share very deep. Some come from very abusive homes, but because they create safe spaces during life orientation, these young people, by the end of the year, they are not only in a position where they develop self-mastery, they are now able to do math at the highest level. They don't do math literacy, they do high-level math. They learn, and of course, indigenous, each one of them must do their own mother tongue education. Language, so that they have competence that is tied to their culture. So we underestimate the importance of rooting people in their culture. So if you're French, you've got to be proud of what it means to be French, but also be aware of the connectedness between your your culture and others. And so my message to business school students is, you have a great future provided you move out of the desk into round tables and you engage peer-to-peer and you challenge the system to move out of these modules and spreadsheets. First, become human, because that's where you unleash all the creative juices. Boy, oh boy, it's exciting to see these young people and what they're doing. So I'm 73, so I can't get back to where you guys are, but I think you have an absolutely amazing future ahead of you.
Mampela, so inspiring. Clem, I'm not going to let you go quite so easily, because the one lens we can put on your work is that, as you know, many businesses have hidden behind a kind of agnosticism that we're kind of almost immune to any activism. We just want to do business and we want as much freedom as possible. That's not how you behaved at Anglo. you did a sensitive reading of the social context and then had the strength of your conviction. Mampela spoke earlier about this amazing ability to overcome the fear of the context and respond. And you did that in a very delicate time in the history of South Africa. Is it not time for business again to adopt a kind of considered, perhaps even activistic role in society?
I totally agree with what you're saying. That this is now the new challenge, and it's happening in business. You know, investors are putting pressure on businesses to go greener. We all know that there's a sort of change in annual general meetings with more searching questions on how businesses are going about you know, their relationship to the environment and to local communities. So yeah, but your point is valid, which is one shouldn't oppose that. It's not a, you know, as Al Gore said, an inconvenient truth. The environment is with us, and that's why I really liked what Mampela was saying, is that we have that very close relationship with nature. So we shouldn't be seeing it as an inconvenient truth. We should be embracing it and saying, what are we going to do to change? And yes, some businesses will take a long time because, you know, they're still in it for the money and for the stock exchange and everything else. I'm afraid to say the pursuit of wealth is still an incredibly strong motive in the human race. So it's going to take time, but reality is beginning to catch up with us. As I said, most of the climate change scientists said we got one thing wrong, which is we thought it was going to happen later on in the century. It's happening right now, and that's why this kind of conversation we're having is so desperate. And I'd like to just quote one person, because I used to, you know, and I'm sure the students sitting behind you will stare at me in disbelief. I used to play guitar on the streets in Paris, in Rue de la Sorbonne and Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And one of the songs that I did was by Bob Dylan, called "The Times They Are A-Changin'." And the times are changing.
Well, Clem, we know why we'll invite you back. We'll do a musical talent of Clem Sunter the next time. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm just going to turn around and see if there are any questions from the audience behind me. Perhaps a thought, comment, or observation. They've all been stunned into silence, I should say.
Morning.
Yeah.
We have one question from Anthony. Anthony, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Please go ahead.
Hi, morning. And so can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yeah, first of all, Clem, thank you very much for a wonderful speech again. I always enjoy listening to you. You've gone a long way since we met at the GSB, funnily enough, when you launched your book on foxes. You have developed a long way since that, and I'm very impressed that you're not standing still, you're going forward all the time. On your scenario planning, there's one important question which you only have at the fringes, which is the growing population of the world. And I think that is the main problem that we're facing now, more important than climate change even. I think the growing population is the cause of climate change, because the resources of the world are getting depleted, and we're getting all this early warning signs of migration. People from Africa are migrating to Europe, from South America to North America, and that's where the problems are coming now. So in your scenarios, I think we need one more scenario. So what is going to happen with the world population? If it keeps on expanding, what's going to happen, and how will that be reduced in the end? Can you give us a little more information on that scenario? Thank you.
The latest UN statistics are suggesting, for the reasons that Mampela gave, which is that with the further advancement of women in the world, and education, and you know, all the things that are happening to empower women, that you know, they're going to make choices in a way about numbers of children which they haven't been allowed to do in the past, and that will naturally bring down the rate of population growth. So in fact, the latest statistic is that at the turn of the century, 2100, there'll be 10.6 billion people in this world. Yeah, the population growth will have virtually flattened out. So the real point is, you know, how are we going to cope with this much bigger number of people? So it's, for me, it's numbers of people rather than the growth. But improving living standards and getting rid of the kind of inequities that we absolutely face at the moment. In fact, the level of inequality, as Thomas Piketty, who's a French economist and who wrote an incredibly good book on 21st century capital, he said the level of inequity in this world today is as bad as it was in the Edwardian era in the last century. That's in the 1910s. And it's because the rate of growth in stock markets and in property prices has far exceeded the rate of growth of salaries and wages. So we're living in this extraordinary world where, as I gave that statistic, and Mampela also referred to it, 1%, the richest 1% of the world's population is responsible for twice the emissions of the poorest 50%, 4 billion people. You know, it's an amazing statistic there. So yeah, you know, it's absolutely about tackling carbon footprint and saying, what are you doing? I would kind of say that right at the moment to Harry and Meghan. You know, they probably have one of the highest individual carbon footprints in the world. And so you've got to point out the contradictions that people have in their lives. And in fact, we have a point in the book where two young people go to a restaurant, and the one of them gets a plate. The young lady gets a plate with a lot of sort of foreign ingredients. Well, she looks at that on the menu, and the guy doesn't know whether to say, well, actually, that's got much higher carbon emissions than something which is produced locally. So, you know, I do think that the population growth is going to sort itself out through advancement. What worries me far more is how we cope with the much greater numbers we have now, and yes, raise their you know, standard of living without you know, just ruining the planet, because it does mean more carbon emissions. It's a huge challenge, and as Mampela also said, there will be people around the world who will come out with technological solutions, but you know, that's something we've got to obviously wait for.
Mampela?
Yeah, I just want to weigh in on this. I think this preoccupation with population growth as a problem is blinding us to the obvious, as Clem has just said. But let's go back to Clem's reference to Steve Jobs. Clem, Steve Jobs is part of the global inequity problem, because the minerals that are going into those iPhones and iPads, and I have them, come from my continent. And if you're worried about migrants going to Europe, create more equitable relationships between the North and the South, so people can have jobs at home and not have to cross the Mediterranean at great risk. So the issue of climate or economic migrants is an issue of global inequity. It is not a population problem. And unless and until we deal with what what Piketty said years ago and continues to say, we are going to end up with massive problems which can be solved today. I mean, when I talk about people having choices, it's in the future, but we have children who have been born today. How are we going to make sure, as Clem says, that we are able to promote well-being for each one of those persons in a healthy biosphere? And it cannot be done unless that 1% travels inside themselves and asks the question, how can you fly into space at how much cost? For a few minutes, just an ego trip. That's basically what it is. And the footprint of that is shocking, right? And you're worried about a woman with 3 children? I mean, really. If we are serious, we've got to identify the real, as we say in South Africa, the real pinching points are not the number of children Mrs. Kumalo had, but the inequity. Even in South Africa, my beloved country, we claim, despite all your high road and low road, we are on the low road, not because we didn't negotiate, but because that political settlement that we are so proud of was not accompanied by what we committed in our own constitution to deal with the legacy of the past. And that legacy issue, you just fly into South Africa, you can see the inequity from the air between the inner city and the core business areas and where the majority of people live. That's the problem, Anthony, that we have to resolve as South Africans and the rest of the world has to deal with. The socio-economic inequities we have are not sustainable, and we need to do something about it, and not tomorrow, but today.
Mampela, thank you. There's if I take a question or a comment from the chat, there's a question about education. And the sort of how-to questions are often the toughest. But the question from Lawrence Okeen is, what would you suggest? Is it a structural education issue? Is it at secondary level? Is it at tertiary level? Is it a curriculum issue? Perhaps some of Aurelio's views, Mampela, may be relevant here as we reconceptualize learning. Clem, you also spoke about the importance of learning. What would you suggest for the education system?
Well, part of what we failed to do after negotiating the political settlement was to look at transforming in a fundamental way the teaching and learning and the education system, which was designed for a different era. But we have a government which has proven itself over the last 27 years as totally incapable of learning from mistakes. Clem, you and I were very active in trying to advise our future leaders and current leaders about what is possible. And this possibility lies in what has been tried. I mean, if we were to change the South African education system from K to 12 using that model, and it's not only the LEAP schools that are doing this, there are many other models of learner-centered education, an education that starts with raising children's awareness of what it means to be human and affirming their individuality and the individual talents that each one of them is born with, doing away with these disciplinary boundaries that are stopping children from using art to understand mathematics and vice versa, which, I mean, Clem, who would have thought Clem could be a musician? But, you know, this is the thing about if you use your brain, you can see so many things, including musical notes. Now, when we stop these boundaries in the learning and teaching process, we have a completely different outcome. But part of the problem in South Africa is also that we inherited a teaching profession from particularly Black teachers, not because they're not good teachers, but many Black teachers in 1994 had gotten into teaching because it was only one of the few available professions. They didn't want to be teachers. And my advice to Mr. Mandela, incidentally, Clem, it was to say to him, Dad, of not do what they did of just saying, well, those who want to take early retirement. If we had done a proper audit of how many of those teachers wanted to remain teachers and what was their level of competence, who would have benefited from in-service training, and of course, affirming teachers who were feeling like the kind of low end of the food chain. And we didn't do that. So the short answer to how can we transform education is like a tree. We've got to deal with a reimagination of education from K to 12, and the university system as it stands has to change. And we can, by changing teaching and learning and centering it on the core values and the core principles, what it means to be human, if we are to promote well-being for all and a healthy biosphere. For example, ecological studies they're an optional course. It should be absolutely vital that from preschool, children know that they are part of an ecosystem that they can be good stewards of from the beginning. So I'm not depressed about this, and I'm not doubting that we can and we will be able to plant those seeds that Clem encourages us to do for a new human civilization that is at peace with itself.
Clem, did you want to respond to the education issue?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we devoted the last chapter to, how education can look. And it's going to be much more interactive between different subjects. You shouldn't have the kind of subject boundaries that you have in education at the moment, for the very reason that Mampela gave, that everything is interconnected. But secondly, obviously, with all the major devices that students have access to now, and hopefully the state can provide those devices to students that don't have them, it's created this much wider world of knowledge. And therefore, we want schools to reflect on how they can use this new technology in a way that allows for a much more intertopical topic approach. The other point we make is that maybe the physical architecture of schools will change. And yes, you've still got to have social interaction between pupils. But a school is something that has been around for 1,000 years, and it hasn't really changed in architecture or any basics. And the question is, what should it be now in terms of providing the best education for young people looking forward into the rest of the century? And as Mampela said, the future of this planet should be woven into that whole education so that we do survive.
Yeah.
Because yes, Jeff Bezos can afford to fly up into the beyond the atmosphere for 10 minutes and so forth and so on. But for most of us, there is no plan B. And for future generations, there's going to be no plan B. This is the planet. And yes, maybe Elon Musk may find a way of getting to Mars and stuff like that. But that's not going to resolve the challenge we face right here, right now.
Thanks so much. I shouldn't miss the opportunity on the subject of business school education to recommend this book systemic leadership learning, leadership development in the era of complexity. Remarkable, fascinating also. I commend it to the House. There's a request from Jan Besaidnout, who has a hand up. Jan?
Just get myself unmuted there. Firstly, honored to be in the company of yourselves at the moment. Clem, I heard you speak at the Izazi Business Breakfast about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago. Since then, Izazi got bought by Ernst & Young, so I'm there now. And then Mampela, I worked with one of your nephews at the Development Bank. Before that, Twene Rampele is still in the Infrastructure Delivery Division over there. Also an honor. I know your life history. Really an honor to be in your company. So I had I can see where I am that sustainability is becoming a buzzword in the corporate world. It's almost cute to hear them all talking about sustainability, but it's still just a buzzword. I think when there could be a tipping point coming, hopefully, when there's enough money to be made from going green, and if the big driving force, the capitalist greed, if one can turn that energy into where they can make money out of green energy, which is already starting to come, and if we just have significant groundswell of business that needs green stuff, then I think we can turn this planet around. And then also just a comment definitely about the sustainability, the social sustainability at the Development Bank. That's what we learned. It's not only about environmental sustainability. Sustainability is about social sustainability, and an unequal world can't work. I did some sums about universal basic income in South Africa, and we just don't have the budget to afford that. And I guess in principle it's got to be done, but the money isn't there. And I guess a question that I have for you is a perspective perhaps on whether it's plausible or possible. At the Development Bank, we're always averse to grants from overseas because it was seen as a handout. But I started to view it as a global taxation system. This continent has been reaped for many years, and many parts of the world have been reaped over many years, growing the economies of other parts of the world. So I didn't have a problem with grant money from overseas anymore because I saw it as a form of global taxation. So what I want to ask and get ideas, do you think it will be plausible ever that we have a more equitable global taxation system which could fund things like universal basic income in other parts of the world that don't have the kind of budgets which some of the Northern Hemisphere countries have?
I'll take it.
Yeah, go ahead, Clem.
Yeah, I know that is actually being talked about at the moment in terms of the green, the green side, which is that are the rich countries going to have to make available billions of dollars, maybe even trillions of dollars to the poor countries in order to achieve the objectives? But in a sense, the pandemic showed us the problem in the world, which is the vaccination started in the rich countries, and 60 to 70% of the population has been vaccinated, and then of course it's now moving across to the poorer countries and to Africa and elsewhere where the vaccination rates have been much lower. So there's a sort of natural tendency by the rich countries to sort of keep things in-house, and I just hope that that this does not apply as far as the environment is concerned, because the virus is international. Until it's sort of stopped everywhere, nobody's safe, and so you've got to have a universal approach, and the same goes for the environment. So I sincerely hope that there's a greater sensitivity towards providing money to the poorer nations in order to make the kind of changes necessary and to improve the quality of people's lives at the same time. And I just want to make one point about this question of green energy. You've got to look from womb to tomb. In other words, from the very beginning of the process to the end. Take electric cars. It's not just you know, the fact that you're going to have electricity going into cars instead of petrol. You've got to look at how those electric cars are constructed. You've got to look at where the electricity is coming from. Is it coming from coal burning power stations, or from tidal or wind energy, or what have you? You've got to look at the entire chain. And Mampella's point about rare earths and stuff like that go into batteries like lithium, and you know, are we going to sort of suddenly run out of a whole bunch of minerals on Earth that have to specifically go into the kind of devices that are made for you know, for green energy transmission? It's not just mobile phones. It'll be huge demand if we switch. Nobody has yet provided the detailed steps required to go from where we are with fossil fuels today to, you know, a green energy economy. And that's the whole point of scenario work, is to work out a detailed narrative of what it takes to get from the present into the future. And I just wish that somebody around the world would be doing that.
Mampela, of course, the Club of Rome has done extensive work on rethinking finance. Any observations there to respond to Jan Besaidnet's a borderline cynical view on whether it's financially viable to be green?
Absolutely. We are in rethinking finance. We are looking at how do we shift financing towards those things that will help on this journey of emergence from emergency, and to stop financing things that are killing us, like fossil fuels. That's one side. But the other side, which is the point you are making about when there is money to be made, people will change. That means the system, there's something wrong with the system. So it's not just the financing and what is being financed, but is how the financial system has become a runaway train. And the addiction that the finance system has for so-called assets, now they're going to climb into green bonds without changing their own lifestyles or their own footprint. What is that going to be? So I really fear for a future where we simply turn the taps of this financialized system into so-called green economy. There is no green economy. There is just a human economy that should take care of the basic needs of each and every human being, because as COVID has taught us, to the extent that there are people who are living in dreadful circumstances, we cannot get on top of COVID, even with the vaccine. So inequality is expensive, not just for the poor people, but also for those who are driving it, who are the rich people. And this brings me to this another knellpunt. This idea that you can solve inequity with basic income grant makes me weep, because we haven't learned anything. We are spending close on 17 billion on social grants. With what outcomes? We have created zombies of young women with children on their backs at the end of each month queuing up. It is disgusting. It is abuse of the dignity of what it means to be human and what it means to be a person. Now, I go back to African culture. In African culture, when we talk about Ubuntu, that you are because I am, it's more than just simply doing good for other people. Every human being's dignity is affirmed by their ability to contribute to the common good. What we have done in South Africa is to disable close on 20 million people from contributing to the economy. And we find these sweets that we give them. I mean, for our president to proudly announce that they're giving grants of 430 or 450 rand per month. Now, come with me to ShopRite or Boxer, the cheapest shop, with 450. Tell me what you're going to buy in terms of necessities. But it's a dummy that's been given to poor people so that the elites can keep themselves in power because those people are voting for them. So this basic income grant, I can tell you that it's not about uprooting poverty. It's not about restoring the dignity of people. It's about keeping the elites in power. It's a disgusting approach. What is needed, and there are lovely models across South Africa, young people who are standing in the streets corners, if they are given the opportunity, they are firm. First of all, you talk to them as people, not as machines. And you invite them to sit down and say, what would you like? If you're given an opportunity, what would you like to do? It's incredible what they do. And through Reimagine South Africa, we are reimagining precisely how we can, in fact, turn around this massively unequal society into a society that enables people to participate in contributing to the common good. And this is not just Mampela and Happy Clappy Ubuntu. Evolutionary biologists, and I recommend this book to all of you. It's called Building Innovation on Millions of Years of Nature's Intelligence. It's written by Lynn Gorison. And in that, she demonstrates that the most prosperous species is the one that contributes the most to the common good. This you learn from ants, from bees. I mean, that's natural intelligence, okay? They don't provide grants to bees that's sleeping in the sun when others are working, right? Every bee contributes to the beehive. And that's how we are wired. If you are not contributing, you become destructive. And are you surprised we've got so much violence in South Africa? Gender-based violence, any violence, addiction, we are the cause of it. Thank you.
The energy and inspiration of Mampela Rampela. That's why we love you. Clem, I'm going to give you an opportunity for closing remarks, and then we'll close.
Well, it's as I said at the very beginning, it's an honor to have the webinar with Mampela and yourself on such a, well, for me, the most important topic of the day. And I just hope that we've contributed to the kind of wisdom required to get the show on the road and get more than just the blah 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 kind of approach, which is you know just not going to work in terms of creating this you know this planet in which, and I love that last remark that Mampela said, you know, in which we're like worker bees, you know, we're all working for the common good, because that approach is necessary for survival. We absolutely need to get away from a purely selfish, you know, greedy, search for money type of philosophy that so many people have in the world today. And I just hope that this small webinar has gone a little way towards achieving that.
It certainly has. Thank you so much. Where the deep study of interconnectedness is really no longer optional. What a privilege it's been for me this morning. My guests have been Mampela Rampela and Clem Sunter. His new book is Thinking the Future, Buy Now for Christmas. It's been fantastic to have all of you with me, and I look forward to seeing you on our next webinars. And I do hope you'll join us then. Have a fantastic weekend, and thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Morné, from our side, I also just want to say thank you very much. And to all of those that have attended, we'll make the recording available as soon as possible. Thank you to the USB alumni for supporting us in this event. And I've just put the link in there. If you're not registered with the Alumni Connect page yet, please do so. But from the Institute for Futures Research, thank you very much. Let's all work together to making South Africa great and to a better possible future for the world, or possible futures for the world. Have a great Friday.
Thanks, everybody.